The year was 1866, and across the vast wetlands of South America, the air itself had turned poisonous, not from gas or smoke, but from the stench of rotting corpses that stretched for miles along the marshy banks of the Paraguay River. What had begun as a calculated gamble by one man's imperial ambitions had transformed into the bloodiest nightmare the continent had ever witnessed. This is the story of horror beyond imagination, where entire armies disappeared not in glorious charges, but drowning in their own blood in swamps that swallowed the living and the dead alike. In the suffocating heat of the South American summer, as disease-ridden soldiers stumbled through knee-deep mud-clutching weapons that jammed with moisture, the Paraguayan War was reaching its most devastating peak. The year 1866 would witness battles so savage, so utterly destructive, that they would redefine what warfare meant in the modern age. Men would die not just from bullets and bayonets, but from cholera that liquefied their insides, from malaria that boiled their brains, and from starvation so complete that soldiers gnawed bark from trees before collapsing into the very trenches they had dug. But this was no ordinary conflict between neighboring states squabbling over borders. This was the collision of an entire continent's future, where a small, landlocked nation dared to challenge the combined might of three empires. At its center stood Francisco Solano López, a man who had walked the gilded halls of Napoleon III's Paris, and returned to Paraguay convinced he could reshape South America through the barrel of a gun. His delusions of grandeur would cost his country everything. By 1866, the scale of destruction had already surpassed anything the Americas had ever seen. The Triple Alliance of Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay had mobilized over 100,000 men against Paraguay's desperate defenders. Yet what made this war unique was not just its size, but its complete and utter brutality. This was warfare where surrender meant torture, where prisoners were massacred as a matter of course, and where entire populations were systematically exterminated. The weapons that thundered across these killing fields represented a technological revolution that would forever change how wars were fought. Soldiers who had trained with flintlock muskets that their grandfathers might have recognized suddenly found themselves facing breech-loading rifles that could kill at distances previously unimaginable. Artillery pieces imported from the gun foundries of Europe hurled shells with devastating precision, while the first machine guns in South American history cut down charging cavalry like wheat before a scythe. Yet it was not the technology alone that made 1866 so horrific. It was how that technology was wielded in terrain that seemed designed by nature to maximize human suffering. The Paraguay River basin, with its endless marshes and impenetrable swamps, created a hellscape where armies could advance only along narrow strips of solid ground, funneling thousands of men into killing zones where artillery could slaughter them by the hundreds with single volleys. Picture, if you will, the morning of May 24, 1866, as the sun rose over the marshlands near Tuyutí. 35,000 Allied soldiers faced 24,000 desperate Paraguayans in what would become the largest battle ever fought on South American soil. The very earth trembled under the weight of so many men preparing to die. Cavalry horses, already weakened by months of disease and poor fodder, stamped nervously as their riders checked weapons they knew might fire only once before the close-quarters butchery began. The Paraguayans had been preparing for this moment for months. Francisco Solano López, the self-styled Napoleon of the Americas, had convinced himself that one decisive victory could break the alliance and secure his vision of Paraguayan dominance. His soldiers, many of them barely more than boys, had been drilled in the French military tactics their president had observed during his European sojourn. They advanced with the precision of European regulars, but they would die with a savagery that shocked even veteran observers. When the guns opened fire that morning at Tuyutí, the sound was unlike anything the continent had ever heard. Witnesses described it as the voice of God himself, angry beyond measure. The new rifled artillery pieces, imported at enormous cost from European arsenals, sent shells screaming across the marsh with mathematical precision. Where they struck, human bodies simply disappeared, vaporized by the explosive force. Men who had been laughing and joking moments before were reduced to red mist and scattered fragments of cloth. But the true horror began when the artillery fell silent and the infantry charges commenced. The Paraguayans came forward in waves, their bayonets glinting in the morning sun, their war cries echoing across the wetlands. They had been told that victory was certain, that God himself favored their cause. Instead, they discovered that the new rifles in Allied hands could kill at ranges where their own weapons were useless. Entire companies collapsed before they had fired a single shot. The carnage was so complete that even the victors were sickened. Brazilian officers, hardened by years of frontier warfare, wept openly as they walked through fields carpeted with Paraguayan dead. Bodies lay so thick that it was impossible to walk without stepping on corpses. The wounded, crying out in Spanish and Guarani, begged for water that would never come. Many would die slowly over the following days, their wounds festering in the humid heat. Yet Tuyutí was only the beginning of 1866's catalogue of horrors. The Paraguayan losses there, nearly 13,000 casualties in a single day, represented more than half of López's best troops. These were not the green recruits who would fill the ranks later, but veteran soldiers who had trained for years. Their destruction meant that Paraguay could never again mount a major offensive operation. From that day forward, the war became a slow strangulation, a methodical extermination of an entire nation. The Allied commanders, confident that Paraguayan resistance was broken, pressed forward toward the fortress of Humaitá. This massive earthwork, bristling with cannons and protected by the convergence of two rivers, was the key to Paraguay's defense. But between the Allied armies and their objective lay a landscape that seemed designed to frustrate every military plan ever devised. The approaches to Humaitá wound through a maze of swamps, lagoons, and patches of jungle, connected only by narrow strips of firm ground. An army could advance only in single file along these causeways, presenting perfect targets for Paraguayan artillery positioned on commanding heights. Every step forward cost dozens of lives. Every mile gained required hundreds of casualties. As the Allied forces struggled through this nightmare terrain, disease began to take its toll. Cholera, that ancient enemy of armies, struck with devastating effect. Soldiers who had survived the bullets at Tuyutí died writhing in agony as their bodies expelled every drop of fluid they contained. Malaria followed, turning strong men into shivering wrecks who could barely hold their rifles. Dysentery completed the unholy trinity, leaving entire units too weak to fight. The medical services of all armies were overwhelmed within weeks. Field hospitals became charnel houses where the wounded died in rows, abandoned by surgeons who had run out of medicine, bandages, and hope. Officers began to estimate that for every man killed by enemy action, 7 more would die of disease. The war was consuming its participants as surely as any fire consumes fuel. In September 1866, as the rainy season transformed the already treacherous terrain into an aquatic graveyard, the Allied commanders made a decision that would define the rest of the year. Rather than continue their costly advance through the swamps toward Humaitá, they would attempt to outflank the fortress by striking at the fortified position of Curupaity. What they did not realize was that they were walking directly into the most perfectly designed killing ground in military history. General José Eduviges Díaz had spent months preparing Curupaity for exactly this moment. Unlike the open fields where traditional battles were fought, this position represented something entirely new in South American warfare. 2,000 yards of interconnected trenches snaked across the landscape, each section designed to support the others in a web of overlapping fire. 49 cannons, ranging from massive siege guns to rapid-firing field pieces, commanded every approach. Between them, Congreve rocket stands added their own particulate of terror, Bran launching explosive projectiles that screamed through the air like demons. But it was not just the weapons that made Curupaity so deadly. Díaz understood something that many of his contemporaries had failed to grasp. The new rifled firearms had fundamentally changed the mathematics of warfare. Where once a defending force needed to outnumber attackers to hold a position, modern weapons meant that a single well-positioned soldier could kill dozens of advancing enemies before they came within range to return fire effectively. The Paraguayan general had studied the reports from Tuyutí with the cold eye of a professional soldier. He had seen how his countrymen died in their thousands attempting frontal assaults against prepared positions. Now he would reverse the equation. Let the alliance armies come to him across open ground. Let them discover what it meant to advance into the teeth of modern firepower with nowhere to hide. The Allied plan, conceived in the comfortable headquarters tents miles from the actual fighting, seemed simple enough on paper. 9,000 Argentine troops would assault the left flank of the Paraguayan line, while 11,000 Brazilians struck the right. 20,000 men in total, supported by their own artillery, advancing against an estimated 5,000 defenders. The mathematics appeared overwhelming in their favor. What the Allied commanders failed to understand was that those 5,000 Paraguayans occupied positions that had been engineered with scientific precision. Every fold in the ground had been surveyed and mapped. Every possible avenue of approach had been measured and marked with range stakes. The defenders knew exactly where their weapons would be most effective, and they had spent weeks preparing for this single moment. On the morning of September 22nd, as mist rose from the marshes and the first rays of sunlight pierced the humid air, the greatest military disaster in Argentine history was about to unfold. The Allied artillery opened the engagement with a thunderous bombardment that shook the earth for miles around. Shells screamed overhead in perfect arcs, exploding among the Paraguayan trenches in geysers of dirt and smoke. For 2 hours, the cannons roared without pause, hurling tons of iron and steel into the enemy positions. When the barrage finally lifted, an eerie silence settled over the battlefield. Smoke drifted across the torn landscape like fog, obscuring the Paraguayan lines from view. Allied officers, watching through their field glasses, convinced themselves that nothing could have survived such devastation. The enemy trenches appeared empty, abandoned. Victory seemed assured before the infantry had even begun their advance. The first wave of attackers emerged positions with D from there, the confidence of men who believed the hard work had already been done. Argentine soldiers, their bayonets fixed and their regimental colors flying, marched across the muddy ground in perfect formation. Brazilian columns advanced alongside them, their officers calling out encouragement as they approached what they assumed were shattered enemy defenses. They had covered perhaps half the distance to the Paraguayan lines when the first rifle shots cracked out from positions that were supposed to be empty. Individual soldiers stumbled and fell, but the advance continued. These were isolated snipers, the officers reasoned, survivors who would be quickly overwhelmed by superior numbers. The real shock was still coming. When the Paraguayans opened fire with their full strength, the effect was unlike anything witnessed before in South American warfare. 49 cannons spoke as one voice, sending canister shots screaming across the battlefield in deadly clouds of metal fragments. The Congreve rockets added their own distinctive shriek to the symphony of destruction, trailing sparks as they arced through the air before exploding among the advancing columns. But it was the rifle fire that truly broke the Allied assault. 7 battalions of Paraguayan infantry, their weapons loaded and aimed with mathematical precision, delivered volleys that cut down entire companies in seconds. The new Minié rifles, capable of accurate fire at ranges that would have been impossible with the old smoothbore muskets, reached out to touch men who thought themselves safely beyond enemy range. The Argentine left flank, which had advanced with such confidence minutes earlier, simply disintegrated. Soldiers who had survived the initial volleys found themselves trapped in open ground with no cover except the bodies of their fallen comrades. Those who attempted to retreat discovered that the Paraguayan positions had been designed to catch them in crossfire from multiple directions. There was no safe path backward, only death delivered with industrial efficiency. The Brazilian assault on the right met the same fate, but with an added dimension of horror. The terrain there sloped downward toward the Paraguayan trenches, creating a natural amphitheater where the defenders could observe their targets with perfect clarity. Brazilian soldiers, many of them veterans of previous campaigns, found themselves advancing down a slope that became steeper with every step, directly into the muzzles of weapons they could not even see. When the Brazilian columns reached the first line of Paraguayan trenches, a few desperate men actually managed to leap into the earthworks with their bayonets ready. For a brief moment, hand-to-hand combat raged along the enemy line as Brazilian soldiers grappled with Paraguayan defenders in the mud and smoke. But these were isolated pockets of resistance. The Seacon of trenches, positioned lined on higher ground and untouched by the preliminary bombardment, opened fire on the Brazilians from behind, trapping them between 2 walls of death. The slaughter continued for hours, but the outcome had been determined in the first few minutes. Of the 20,000 Allied soldiers who had advanced that morning, over 8,000 would never return to their lines. The Paraguayan casualties, by contrast, numbered fewer than 100. It was a ratio of destruction that defied comprehension, a demonstration of what modern defensive warfare could achieve when properly executed. As night fell over Curupaity, the battlefield presented a scene from the deepest circles of hell. Argentine and Brazilian dead lay in windrows where they had fallen, their bodies twisted into impossible positions by the violence of their deaths. The wounded, those fortunate enough to still draw breath, cried out in the darkness for help that would be slow in coming. Many would die before dawn, their voices joining the chorus of agony that rose from the killing ground. The psychological impact of Curupaity on the Allied armies was perhaps even more devastating than the physical losses. These were not green recruits who had broken under fire, but veteran soldiers who had fought in previous campaigns and considered themselves equal to any enemy. To see such men reduced to helpless victims by an unseen foe challenged everything they understood about warfare. Morale, already strained by months of disease and hardship, collapsed entirely in many units. The aftermath of Curupaity sent shockwaves through the Allied command that reverberated far beyond the blood-soaked trenches of Paraguay. Generals who had planned the assault from the safety of their headquarters tents now found themselves confronting a truth that no amount of military theory could explain away. The age of cavalry charges and massed infantry assaults, the tactics that had dominated South American warfare for generations, had died in those muddy fields alongside 8,000 of their finest soldiers. Emperor Pedro II of Brazil, upon receiving the casualty reports, reportedly stood in stunned silence for several minutes before dismissing his entire staff. The numbers seemed impossible to comprehend. How could a nation as small as Paraguay, already bloodied and weakened by previous defeats, inflict such devastating losses on forces that outnumbered them 4-1? The answer lay not in Paraguayan superiority, but in the terrible mathematics of modern warfare that European generals had been learning on their own battlefields for decades. The rifles that had cut down the Allied columns at Curupaity represented more than mere technological advancement. They embodied a fundamental shift in how wars would be fought for generations to come. The old smoothbore muskets, inaccurate beyond 50 yards and requiring nearly a minute to reload, had permitted the kind of close-quarters combat that favored courage over precision. A brave soldier could charge across open ground with reasonable hope of reaching his enemy before being shot down. But the new rifled weapons, with their spiraled barrels and conical bullets, could kill with accuracy at ranges exceeding 300 yards. A defending force armed with such weapons could deliver multiple volleys into attacking columns long before those attackers came close enough to return effective fire. The implications were staggering. Traditional military wisdom, built on centuries of experience, had become not merely obsolete but actively suicidal. Francisco Solano López, despite his grandiose delusions, had grasped this reality with chilling clarity. During his extended sojourn in Europe, he had witnessed demonstrations of the latest military technology and understood its potential for transforming warfare. While his enemies still thought in terms of glorious cavalry charges and heroic infantry assaults, López had returned to Paraguay determined to create a modern army capable of fighting according to the new rules. The weapons flowing into South America during 1866 read like a catalogue of industrial death. Breech-loading rifles that could be fired and reloaded, while lying prone, eliminated the vulnerable moments when soldiers had to stand upright to ram powder and ball down a muzzle. Rifled artillery pieces achieved accuracy that made the old smoothbore cannons seem like toys by comparison. Most terrifying of all, the first machine guns were beginning to appear on South American battlefields, weapons capable of delivering the firepower of an entire infantry company from a single position. Yet alone, technology could not explain the horrific casualties of 1866. The terrain itself seemed designed to amplify the destructive potential of these new weapons. The Paraguay River Basin, with its maze of waterways and marshlands, channeled armies into narrow corridors where defensive firepower could achieve maximum effect. Attacking forces found themselves compressed into killing zones with no room to maneuver and no cover except the bodies of their fallen comrades. The environmental challenges faced by both armies defied imagination. The rainy season transformed already treacherous marshlands into an aquatic nightmare, where soldiers disappeared entirely into sinkholes that opened without warning. Equipment became useless within days of exposure to the constant humidity. Leather rotted, metal rusted, and gunpowder absorbed so much moisture that weapons misfired more often than they functioned properly. But it was disease that truly transformed the Paraguayan War into an apocalyptic nightmare. Cholera, malaria, dysentery, typhoid, and smallpox swept through the camps with devastating efficiency. Medical knowledge of the era proved utterly inadequate to cope with epidemics that killed soldiers faster than battles could. Field hospitals became morgues where the living waited to die alongside those already claimed by disease. Dr. José Maria da Silva Paranhos, a Brazilian military surgeon who kept detailed records throughout the war, documented conditions that read like descriptions of medieval plagues. Entire regiments would be reduced to skeleton crews within weeks of arriving in Paraguay. Men who had survived the bullets at Tuyutí would die writhing in agony as cholera liquefied their internal organs. Others would waste away from malaria, their bodies burning with fever while their minds descended into delirium. The logistics of maintaining armies in such conditions pushed 19th century military science beyond its breaking point. Brazilian forces required supplies to be shipped from Rio de Janeiro, a journey of over 1,500 nautical miles up rivers that grew more treacherous with each passing month. Argentine troops depended on overland supply lines that stretched across hundreds of miles of hostile territory where Paraguayan raiders struck without warning. Food became a weapon as effective as any rifle or cannon. Both sides employed scorched earth tactics that left vast areas of countryside uninhabitable. Villages were burned, crops destroyed, and livestock slaughtered to deny resources to enemy forces. The civilian population, caught between the competing armies, faced starvation on a scale that reduced entire communities to scavenging in the ruins of their former lives. The psychological toll of such conditions manifested in ways that military commanders had never encountered before. Soldiers who had shown courage in battle would break down completely when confronted with the systematic destruction of everything they had known. Desertion rates soared as men concluded that death in battle was preferable to the slow agony of watching their comrades waste away from disease and hunger. Yet perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the 1866 campaign was how quickly all participants adapted to level sality that would have been unthinkable at the war. Prisoners whose beginning might once have been treated according to civilized conventions found themselves tortured for information or executed to eliminate the burden of feeding them. Wounded enemies were left to die rather than waste medical supplies that were desperately needed for one's own forces. The Battle of Estero Belaco in May had provided an early glimpse of this descent into savagery. When Paraguayan forces launched a surprise attack against Allied positions, the fighting devolved into hand-to-hand combat of unprecedented ferocity. Bayonets, machetes, and even entrenching tools became weapons as soldiers grappled in the mud for survival. Witnesses described scenes where men fought with their bare hands after their weapons broke, clawing at each other's faces and throats with desperate fury. General Venancio Flores, the Uruguayan commander who barely escaped capture during that engagement, later wrote that he had witnessed behavior that challenged his fundamental beliefs about human nature. Soldiers who had been civilized men just months earlier now fought like animals, showing no mercy to wounded enemies and taking trophies from the bodies of the dead. The thin Venn disciplinaire of military that separated organized warfare from pure barbarism had been stripped away by the relentless pressure of the campaign. The transformation was not limited to the enlisted ranks. Officers who had begun the war as gentlemen, educated in European military academies and trained in the codes of civilized warfare, found themselves ordering actions that violated every principle they had once held sacred. The execution of prisoners became routine. The bombardment of civilian targets was justified as military necessity. The systematic destruction of entire communities was rationalized as strategic requirement. Francisco Solano López himself embodied this moral collapse. The man who had once walked the elegant salons of Paris, who had courted European aristocrats and fancied himself a sophisticated leader, now ruled Paraguay through terror that would have impressed the most ruthless tyrants of history. His own soldiers lived in constant fear of execution for the slightest infraction. His officers competed to demonstrate their loyalty through increasingly savage acts against both enemies and their own subordinates. The Irish adventuress Eliza Lynch, Lopez's mistress and closest advisor, played her own role in this descent into madness. Once a refined woman who had graced the courts of Europe, she now encouraged the president's most violent impulses while accumulating wealth stripped from the corpses of Paraguay's enemies. Her influence over Lopez became so complete that many observers considered her the true power behind the throne, a Lady Macbeth figure who whispered poison into the ear of a consumed man all-redded by megalomania. As autumn arrived in 1866, the character of the war underwent another fundamental shift. The great battles of the early months gave way to a grinding siege warfare that would define the conflict's final phases. The Allied armies, bloodied by their defeats at Curupaity and other engagements, adopted tactics that emphasized firepower over maneuver. Rather than risk more frontal assaults against prepared positions, they would pound Paraguayan fortifications into rubble with artillery bombardments that continued for days without pause. The year 1866 had rewritten the rules of warfare in letters of blood across the marshlands of Paraguay. What began as Lopez's imperial dream had become a masterclass in modern military horror, where technology and terrain combined to create killing fields that would haunt the continent for generations. The battles of Tuyutí and Curupaity had demonstrated that courage alone could no longer triumph over scientific precision in the art of death. As the guns fell silent and the dead were counted in their tens of thousands, South America had learned what Europe already knew, that the age of romantic warfare had ended, and in its place rose an industrial machinery of destruction that would define conflicts for the century to come.